It is the 29th of October, and our reading for this day in Baptist history is a wilderness preacher of preachers. Our verse comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 18. What is my reward then? Verily that, when I preach the gospel, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. Bedford County, Virginia is known for the physical beauty of its rolling hills and majestic mountains crowned by the peaks of Otter that lift their heads some 4,000 feet into the air. In the early 1800s, only the rugged and stout of heart dared to push into this hostile environment in an effort to dig out an existence in the valleys watered by the crystal streams springing from the steep cliffs that surrounded them. The country was sparsely settled, and the dwellings were by no means models of comfort. These settlers had not come for comfort and ease, but for an opportunity to labor hard in freedom and live a simple existence in the clean, clear atmosphere of the surrounding environment. They lived much in the open air and can be described as plain, industrious, unaspiring people, not distinguished for their literary tastes, for they were a laboring rather than a reading people. It was into this country and surrounding area that William Harris moved from Buckingham County, where he had made his home and carried out most of his ministry. He had begun his ministry in Buckingham, but united with the church at Goose Creek, later called Mount Zion, where he was ordained into the gospel ministry. William Harris belonged to a class of preachers who had little opportunity for education or theological training. They were blessed with sound minds and usually with strong bodies, and to these were added piety, experience, an inextinguishable desire for the salvation of souls, and a readiness and fervency in preaching the principles of the gospel of Jesus Christ. They preached not for fame or wealth, but because they believed that they had a divine call to the work. Their own hands ministered to their necessities, while they gave themselves as they had opportunity to prayer and to the ministry of the word. They were plain, sensible, godly, earnest, laborious men who preached because they must, their consciences testifying to the words of the Apostle Paul, "Woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel." I quote, "Their vocation was to preach, and preach they did. If their hearers contributed to their support, well, they were thankful and encouraged. But if their hearers contributed nothing, it was still, well, the neglect concerned their hearers more than it concerned them. They were laboring for Christ and expected their reward from him." End of quote. This describes the character and quality of William Harris and his contemporaries. Under his ministry, multitudes were converted, and by his hands, many were buried with Christ in baptism. During 1 year, he baptized 250 persons, and during his entire ministry, he must have baptized at least 3,000 candidates. It must be remembered that this was a period when the candidate was required to give a clear statement of a conversion experience and evidence of a changed life. Also, this took place in a sparsely settled wilderness. During the course of his ministry, he pastored 11 churches, 5 of which he planted. One called Suck Spring, he pastored for 50 years. His motive was the love of Christ, to the end that he desired to see sinners converted. He did not look for, and I quote, vacant pulpits, inviting fields of service, or liberal salaries, but the barn, forest, or open space would serve him for a temple, a stump or stone, or the level earth for a pulpit, and wherever he could find sinners to hear him, he had a call to preach. End of quote. Bedford County became known as the birthplace of Baptist preachers. The ministry of William Harris contributed greatly to this reputation. I have before me a list of 23 outstanding Baptist preachers who were baptized by Elder Harris. One of them, Dr. William E. Hatcher, describes the appearance of Father Harris as the young people called him, as one, and I quote, with hair as white as snow, with a face tinged with an Indian hue and cheekbones very high, with an eye blue as the sky and radiant with a light not of the world, with a voice mellow, musical, and irresistible when he sang. End of quote. Dr. J.B. Jeter, whom Elder Harris had helped with his assurance of salvation, described his character as, and I quote, above reproach. End of quote. He continued by saying, and I quote, a countryman not remarkable for his charitable judgment of men, who had known him well for 40 years, on being asked if he had ever heard any evil report of him, replied with promptness and energy, no, and if I had, I should have known that it was a lie. The elder was not a great preacher, if greatness is to be measured by learning, logical acumen, an accurate knowledge of the Scriptures, or a vivid imagination. If, however, ministerial greatness is to be estimated by a capacity for usefulness, few had a higher claim to it than Elder Harris. End of quote. William Harris went to his eternal reward October 29, 1865. For 1 year his health had been failing. He continued to conduct his family worship until paralysis deprived him of his power of speech. He even then insisted that his family should gather to pray and read. On the morning before his death, unable to speak, he pointed again and again heavenward, the goal for which he longed. A few moments before his departure, a grandson said to him, and I quote, I suppose you are now going home? End of quote. With an affirmative gesture, he replied to that question and finally fell asleep in Jesus. To God be the glory.